typical that our age ranges in the GED programs were higher, and that was actually statistically significant. GED learners are older learners in our programs. What was atypical, and this is something that really blew me away, 94% of our learners in the credits program already had a high school diploma. And I'm going to show you some things about high school learners a little later on. I'm not the most popular person with the Department of Education right now in Prince Edward Island, and you'll see why. Don't kill the messenger, this is just what we found. And 71% of the younger learners were in the credits. So we're getting a younger population in our adult ed programs. Are you seeing that in your programs too? Like more of the under 25 group? Okay, wait to see what we found out about some of them. Employment. Remember I said we gathered information about employment? 64% in the credits were employed full-time. So they were taking a full school load and they were working full-time. That's phenomenal. When you think of our post-secondary students doing that, most people don't think of adult learners as doing that, upgrading learners doing that. We had a few that were not employed. We had a few students that were in students retired. I forget what that last line was about. Oh, yes, students that identified they were retired or are an unusual category. It wasn't really, they weren't really tied to the labor force to begin with. That's how they were broken down. So we had a lot that were full-time, and 75% of the part-time workers were in credits. So we see credits as being a real vehicle to move them through to post-secondary because they're already tied to the labor force. Obviously, they want to make a change in their life. Now, we had a lot of attrition from the study, and that's something that when you're a researcher, you learn to live with. But it was interesting because the attrition from the study, we actually examined that data more closely than we had planned on. We lost about, let's see, we had 481 to start with, 249 stayed in the study, so a little better than 50% stayed. We lost 232, so that meant they wouldn't do the post-intervention testing or they wouldn't do the 6-month follow-up. Either one meant that they had attrition from the study. But what we found was attrition from the study was mostly from our night programs. So that told us a little bit about motivation. But we were also able to still use the data because they had confirmed their presence in the program. They'd given us permission to use their data. So we still had their outcomes. Maybe not their final literacy evaluation, but we still had their outcomes. So we also found that older learners were more likely to stay in the study. And you're going to see this recurring throughout my results, what's happening with the younger learners. 59% of the attrition occurred within the 16 to 25 age group. And you'll see some of the results later on. Whether that accounts for why they left or not, the study, we don't know. So here are some significant learner and program factors related to the sample attrition. These are just the people that left. We studied them. The younger learners were 25% more likely to leave the study than older learners. So in other words, they didn't want to be measured. They didn't want to follow through with surveys. They didn't want to follow up. By program, the night enrollment, they were 22% more likely to leave. And we sort of attribute that to the amount of time they spend in the program at night. They didn't have a lot of time, so I think they said, okay, well, I'm not going to do this stuff because it's taken away from my study time. So, but we don't know for sure. That's an educated guess on our parts. And what we were comparing to, this attrition, we compared it to all the things we thought might have caused them to leave. Like, for example, was it because they had hearing loss or learning disabilities or visual disabilities? None of that made any difference. None of it made any difference by program, too. We thought, well, maybe it's us. Maybe it's some of our instructors. Maybe it's some of our program and some of our teaching methods, because we also had measured teaching modality in that. Maybe it was their literacy scores. Maybe that's why they dropped out. There was no correlation to any of that. So attrition came down to age and what programs they were taking. So good information for us from a program perspective. So those that stayed in the study, we did, 67% persisted in their program of study. So the ones that did leave, the reasons that they left, like actually left the program, so they didn't just leave the study, they actually left the program. They left to go to work, which, hey, that's what we want them to do, is go to work, so we're not going to stop them from that. Some had medical reasons, 16% left for attendance reasons. We're very strictly monitored for attendance in our programs. They're government funded, there is no charge for the student, so students have to be there. So we have a whole policy around that. If you miss so much time, then you're given some time to correct your behavior. If that doesn't happen, then we ask you to leave because there's other people who want to see. 7% left because it was too hard, not what they expected, or unknown reasons. Very few said too hard or not what they expected. So that tells me that our programs, it's not the program itself that's turning people away. If they leave, it's for other reasons. But at the end of the day, we still had 210 in the program that completed a credit and 98 that completed their GED prep. So when we started examining, this is where we get into the fun stuff, how they actually completed, what were the influences. Again, we came back to the learner. 16 to 25 were 16.7% less likely to complete than anybody over the age of 25. The location, this was interesting. We found that our urban sites had a higher non-completion rate. Now, I think that's because of the community nature of Prince Edward Island. If you go in your small community, it's your aunt teaching you, or it's your cousin that's a colleague in the class. So there's a little more of connectedness. So, and the CLE Pro score. So in other words, how they completed that CLE evaluation dictated their completion rate. Now, this is interesting because the higher Pro scores positively influence completion. No surprise for any of us there, correct? But the value of that in the multivariate analysis was a 0.1. And you think, oh, 0.1, that doesn't mean very much. It actually does. 0.1 means for every point that their literacy scores were better, they had a 10% increase in probability of completion. That's pretty significant. 50 points better, 50% greater chance of completion. We know this as educators. It's amazing when you sit with non-educational people, especially economists, it's amazing how that's not something we were aware of. So other things we compared to was the gender, the instructor, the teaching modality, the type of program, the returning student. For example, we have people that come back year after year. Did that affect completion? We have high school diploma. Their completion rate was no different. Employment status, that didn't have an impact on completion, or enrollment types. None of those things showed significance in the data analysis. But let's take a look at the gains. The learners in the GED program had larger gains than the night program for all subjects except reading. Now this is a function of time. In the day program, they're coming 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. In the night program, they're coming 6 hours a week. So it only makes sense they would learn more. But the largest learning gain was in reading for night. So for this particular year, we felt they just must have had an exceptional reading level. And 78 points in science in a day. That was the average learning gain in science points in the GED scoring. That's a pretty significant gain. Science and math are the hardest things for those learners to accomplish. So that was a very important gain. We show a slight learning loss there of 5 points in social studies. That's within the range, the variation of the test, so the standard deviation. So it's really not a loss. But social studies is also the hardest one to prepare them for because there isn't a set curriculum around the social studies. There isn't a set number of questions. It's very much about current events and very much about social infrastructure, political infrastructure, and things like that. So it's a little harder to predict what might be asked. But the gains, there was differences in averages between the final exam and the baseline scores. And what we did was we separated out the people that passed their GED versus the people that didn't pass their GED. And we examined that data. And for those who passed the GED, they had consistent gains in all subject areas. And you can see where the gains are fairly high. 81 points, 83 points, 66 points was the lowest gain. But for those who did not pass, they started with lower baseline scores. Which again, as educators, this only makes sense to us. They just weren't ready. We can't stop them from going to write. If they decide they're going to write, they have the right to go and write their exam. We know they're not ready, but they don't necessarily. But this is empirical evidence around that readiness. So we found that not only did they not pass, but they actually were doing less than they had done from baseline. So whether that's a function of the nervousness, we don't have an exact answer for that. And the largest loss was in social studies. And again, we come back to that being one of the harder ones. So this was about how they gained in terms of GED. We thought, well, we've got to examine this a little more closely. So are you familiar with the GED marking system, the numbers? Okay. The GED by pass rates what we did was we pulled out what were their pretest rate scores for those that passed, and what were their pretest rate scores for those who didn't pass, and look at it a little more clearly. So the green, you can see, those were pretest scores for those who passed. And see how their numbers are quite high, 476, 469, 502, 435, 468. Now the pass mark for the GED, I believe, is 500 pass mark? It's around 500, I believe. 450, 500?
That's 450.
450. I've got it down there, pass mark. See, I was just making sure you read it. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm out. Anyway, 450. Now, you'd say to yourself, well, gee, if they came in and their score was that high, then why not just have them go right away? As a practice, and as instructors, you probably do this as well, our instructors in the GED program will say, give yourself at least a 50-point spread before you go and write. And if you have the 50-point spread, chances are you'll pass. And we found, this study has validated that practice, so that is the best practice in terms of measuring the outcomes. And you can clearly see the difference between how well they were doing when they walked through the door versus how well they did when they went and wrote. And so the comparison of the average scores was something that was really important. And it's value to show current GED students that, you know, this is what happens if we're not prepared. The critical tipping point we determined to be 425. So that was, if they were below 425, there's no way they were ready. And it was going to take longer to get them ready. If they were above 425, they had a better chance. So that turned out to be our critical tipping point. What's happening between 425 and 450? We're not 100% sure. We have to examine that a little more closely. And we need a lot more numbers to do that. How long did it take them? Again, this isn't rocket science for those of us that have been in the system and working with adult learners. It was a major surprise to the economists. If they start from a lower point, it takes them longer to get where they need to go. We all know that. The assumption behind people, or the assumption with people that are not educators, is that we're all starting from the same spot. It's like a race. There's a start line, and away you go. And it's all about how fast. And this is a big point to get through to stakeholders and funding partners. You know, not everybody starts at the same point. And that's what dictates how long it will take. So for those who passed, they had averages of 122 to 129 hours in the program. For those who did not pass, they had 153 to 240 hours in the program, and they still weren't ready. So we're talking a lot more investment in those people to get them where they need to go. So that was important. And I even broke down the time frames by subject just to show that this was consistent. It didn't matter what they took. This was consistent across the board. Well, let's look at what happened in the credit programs. We had taken a measure when they came in, their last high school mark in English or math, and that was what we considered baseline, and we averaged that. So we had that in our data, and the average was 59.8. So you can see right off the bat, we're not getting the high end, which you wouldn't expect in an upgrading program. We're getting people that were, you know, in the 60s, and probably the marks weren't good enough to get them into post-secondary. So this makes sense that they'd be in our upgrading program. The average learning gain was 21 marks. So we took their baseline and then we thought, okay, what's their final mark going out the door, or their average of marks going out the door, and what's the difference? And the average difference was 21 marks. So we're seeing an improvement up into the 70s for these people. And I'm not a big advocate of marks. I don't believe that tells you everything, but the rest of the world lives by marks. So you've got to live by marks. Now here's the interesting part. We're going to get back to these youth with high school diplomas. They had learning gains of 19.2 marks in credit programs, while the other credit learners who didn't have a high school diploma had average learning gains of 23.8 marks, and that was statistically significant. So in other words, the people that already came in with a high school diploma didn't accomplish as much as those people who came in and did not have a high school diploma. That surprised us.
Motivation?
Well, we're going to see a little bit more about this. This is the slide that has made me unpopular with the education system in Prince Edward Island. I kept coming across this data around the high school diplomas, and finally I realized, duh, I've got a subpopulation here that I have to look at. So I pulled them out and I ran some comparisons